Welcome everybody. We're pleased today to be able to present to you the new landscaping project around the new entrance building. So the project, as we are a botanical garden, some of the key things that botanic gardens need to consider when we look at design is that we are a mission-based organization, and the definition of a botanic garden is of a garden holding documented living collections to support conservation, research, education, and display. And our mission at the Botanic Garden, of course, is to discover and share knowledge about plants and their environment in order to preserve and enrich life. So you can see the mirroring of those two concepts on this slide, on the upper and lower portions of this slide. One of the really important things, of course, is that we develop the landscape and add plants to the collections that support this. And so we can regularly curate the collections to add plants to support our scientific mission. And that is our own internal scientific research, but also to support exchange of plant material to support a wide range of research projects around the world from those that request plant material. And that can be everything from plant naming, taxonomy, to discovering compounds to prevent disease, all the way to conservation genetics. So wide range of support of research that our living collections, the plants in the garden, support. And also our collections are also key to conservation, and more than just a window into the garden's work, which we like to say the living collections are, because you get to be immersed in the garden's collections and see the garden's actual mission when you visit the garden. You have to realize that the collections in the garden are an active part of that conservation. So the species that we're adding, we're actually working on conservation and preserving, doing propagation protocols on, cultivation protocols, and we're holding them to conserve them in the collection. So very much as key to this project was making sure that we could incorporate those species and making sure that all of our visitors, those that visit the garden, were immersed in the mission of the garden. And then also, when you do a big project like this, you have to consider how to fit that project into existing landscapes and fit large buildings into the project. And that's a process called master planning. And that's really key as well, to be able to make sure that the envelope of that building is used correctly and the landscape performs a variety of uses. So those concepts, and I think you'll hear today how we've collaborated to be able to build all of those mission-based concepts and the master planning concepts together to deliver this landscape. I'm pleased today to be joined by Michael Ferguson and Matt Sickle, both of Michael Ferguson Landscape Associates, and we're very pleased to be able to work with them on this project. And today you'll hear various different aspects of planning of the landscape. Michael's going to take us on the larger overall master planning view and the landscape architecture view. I'm going to take you through a little bit of the mission-based incorporation of plant species and how we're working through the project on the ground. And Matt's going to talk about the plant design. So we hope you enjoy, and we'll see you at the end of the presentation. And I'm going to hand it over to Michael to talk about the next slide.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andrew. And I want to say at the outset that working with the Missouri Botanical Garden has been, without a doubt, one of the great privileges and pleasures of my career. It's not only a great place, but it has a great staff, people passionate, dedicated, smart, and hardworking that formed the working group, as well as a great steering committee. And both of those entities had a major role in all of the development of our thoughts and ideas. Before I get into those ideas, I thought it'd be good to give you a brief introduction to the broader practice we're engaged in, to give you a framework and context of what we're doing at the garden. We're located in Old Town, Alexandria, Virginia, on King Street. If we headed directly west on King Street, 700 miles, on the 38th parallel, that is the latitude line that wraps around the globe, we'd find ourselves in St. Louis. So in many ways, it's wonderful. Horticulturally speaking, we feel like we're right back at home again. And home is kind of a small studio by general standards. I like it that way. It's intentional, 12, 13 people. 4 of those people have been important contributors to the design. I'm on the left. Matt Sickle is on the far right. Matt's led the planting design, conservatory design of the project. He's with us today as well. Beata Corcoran, project director. Cameron Aroon managed the project. Everyone here had significant contributions to the thought, to the thinking behind the design for the project. In terms of the kinds of work we do, that is the types and scale of projects, we do a wide variety. A lot of it does include cultural landscapes, that is oftentimes, most often, places of visitation. But even within that category, they vary a great deal in nature and location, from very distant and very ancient places like our work at Petra, great Nabatean site in Jordan, and certainly one of the greatest archaeological sites of the world, to powerful and very potent places like the American Cemetery at Omaha Beach in Normandy, France. You're looking at a new visitor center that we did a number of years ago that connects you with the channel before taking you into the cemetery proper. To places more urban, vibrant gathering places like the design of Sundance Square in the middle of downtown Fort Worth. That's really changed the perception of downtown Fort Worth and how people use it. Closer to home, that is in DC, very contemplative places like the Memorial to Disabled Veterans, American Veterans at the foot of Capitol Hill, dedicated by Barack Obama in 2014, or just a little bit up the hill in DC from that, spiritual places like the close of the National Cathedral in Washington. We've been the landscape architects for All Hallows Guild. All Hallows Guild has been responsible for the landscape of the close since its inception, since the cathedral's initial construction 100 years ago. We've been working on the close for the Guild for the last 25 years, so almost a quarter of that time, touching in one way or another most of the 57 acres of the close. You're looking at All Hallows Amphitheater, which we did a number of years ago for the cathedral. You see two of my three triplets in this screen. One of them is just off the screen. And this photograph is a number of years ago because those three triplets just graduated from high school last week, and Olivia in the foreground there and about to take a leap, and she is about to take a leap, headed to St. Louis in the fall to attend Washington University in St. Louis. So of course, I am just thrilled and tremendously pleased at the prospect of that, more than I can say, really. We also work on a lot of important cultural historical sites, like Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, where we did a new visitor center with Ayer St. Gross, our partners here on this project. You're looking at the garden courtyard of that visitor center, which serves as an outdoor lobby for the place. And it's a vibrant, active place and a wonderful way to prepare people for going up the hill to see the mansion. Our introduction to St. Louis came through Washington University. You're looking at the title page of a presentation, interestingly enough, that we made to the university 7 years ago, almost to the week here. That presentation led to our selection to develop the plan for the transformation of the 30 acres, what's become called the East End of the university, that defines and has always been the historic arrival to the campus east of Brookings Hall, which you see at the end of the green there. Landscape is the centerpiece and the framework of that master plan, which we developed. It does include the addition of 9 new buildings and an 800-car parking garage under a central green that frames that iconic view of Brookings Hall with a new and renewed diverse species of shade trees for the alley. It's a place that's intended to be active and vibrant, a place for people, a vibrant place that encourages conversation, but also that includes places for quiet contemplation. It's got a fair share of the traditional turf and trees that is the kind of defining characteristic of the campus, but it also introduces a new paradigm of plantings composed of natives in rich, complex communities that do a number of good things for the environment, increase the biodiversity while they at the same time expand habitat. They exaggerate, they intensify and reflect the rhythm of the seasons. And they also provide, I think, an important uplift to the ecology through the soils program as well as the stormwater management program. Equally important, they enrich the simple beauty of the campus and do it by focusing on plants. And that's certainly a principle and a goal that is very much in common with our work on your garden, but applied in a very, very different way. And it's an important distinction, and certainly one of the things we've enjoyed about the effort there. And Andrew and Matt will tell you more about that after I walk you through the principles and the framework of the plan and a bit about the process of developing that plan as well. If there's a single defining characteristic of the plan and the process, it is, as Andrew mentioned, collaboration. And it has been an ongoing collaboration between the design team, Air St. Gross, locally, Tao and Lee partners, as well as a number of other consultants, but also, and equally important, with the garden, and with the contractor. And you see him or them here in this photograph, Albarisi. They were an integral part of the process from the earliest thinking in the earliest phases of its design. All and everyone focused on a kind of seamless integration of landscape building and construction, where the building is clearly in service to the garden. This photograph it's become kind of sweet to me. It reminds me of the fact that collective collaboration and the process where we gathered around a table and gathered around multiple drawings engaged everyone. And that process, is quite distant now with the dominance of Zoom, and becomes a little nostalgic, a little romantic, and quite sweet when I see it now, and recognize that I appreciate it now in a way I never could have had we not gone through what we've all been through in the recent year. I don't know what I said here when I was talking about this drawing, but it seems to have amused everybody in the room except Andrew. And well, you see Andrew there, and you see Andrew's laser focus, and that laser focus continued throughout the process, and not just for Andrew, but so many people on the garden staff that made great contributions to the development of the design and the ideas behind it. If I was to simplify the goals of the project, they certainly are to create a memorable entry, arrival, visitor experience, one that enhances significantly the visitor experience, one that connects people with plants and the broader natural environment, but maybe most importantly, one that improves the awareness and understanding of the garden's larger mission, its expansive research, its global work, and its global impact. That work began, as all of our work begins, with an effort to understand what we have, what is there, to uncover and understand the particular circumstances of the site as well as the culture of the institution. I'm going to walk you through the high points of that discovery process, but I want to orient you first because I may complicate it a little bit later. In this view, I think you recognize the climatron and the east-west axes that connects it to the Sphinx Pavilion, which was the original entrance to the garden. To its east, or to its north or to its right is the Rose Garden. Beyond that, the Linnaean House, and then beyond that again to the east, the Ridgway Center. As you remember, you enter the Ridgeway Center at level. You came up 12 feet to the second floor, not a wonderful transition, but then you went back down to the garden another 4 feet, where you were greeted by thick plantings, and it very unclear, particularly to the first-time visitor, to understand where you were intended to go or how to get there. Our response in terms of what we thought needed to change was two things, really. One was to establish, maybe for the first time, the real primacy and clarity of the north-south axes, with lines of sight and circulation that connect to the climatron, and so in turn to the historic east-west axes that leads to the Sphinx Pavilion, and at the same time improve the clarity of wayfinding in the garden. With its grades as well as its mass, the Ridgeway Center created a barrier to the garden. Our response was simple, and that was to create a strong visual connection to the garden as we think about the visitor center, but also to pull the garden out to be part of the greeting arrival experience to the north or to the right of that in this drawing. What was described beautifully by Peggy Lentz at the garden was the golden triangle. That is the collection of places that people wanted to be. We said we need to enrich and expand that to become a golden rectangle that expands the area, not only the area number of places, but also the connections between them. And while the Ridgeway Center, I would say, exacerbated the impact of grade changes, we wanted to do everything we could to make that grade change a pleasurable and even an enriching and educational part of the arrival experience. So if I was to kind of summarize our intent in three simple things, it was to bring the garden to the entry experience, to the front, to improve the porosity of the visitor center so that it passes through and makes a clear connection to the garden proper, and then to clarify wayfinding, the understanding and richness of the initial experience that introduces you to the garden as you move further south. Now I'm going to turn you 90 degrees, and that complicates things a little bit. The climatron that was up top now is over in your lower left-hand corner, and the historic east-west axes that connects to the Sphinx Center at the bottom of the page. The visitor center, as it's envisioned now, is composed of three building blocks. On the west is fundamentally sales, theater, introduction to the garden, and the conservatory. That's on the west-hand side. In the middle, dining, cafe, and restrooms. And to the east or to the right, the event center. Those three blocks frame the main entry on the west through the main entrance and the event center. And those are both pass-through lobbies that reinforce two new or kind of confirmed north-south axes, that's vertical on the plan, but then enriched by a series of other east-west axes. I'll come back and talk about those more. I want to touch very briefly on the north entry garden. And that garden provides fundamental introduction to the botanical garden. It's composed of two graceful stairways and a collection of interwoven paths that provide a rich variety of ways to ascend to the center through a rich array of plantings that is conceived as a kind of world woodland that enriches the experience of arrival and introduces the global efforts of the garden. That includes water associated with those stairs and walks. You see some of the early sketches here of those ideas, all of those leading up to the main lobby that becomes an extension of the garden and a kind of lantern in the larger landscape. The lobby inside is a pass-through lobby. It includes ticketing and information, as well as access to dining and sales. Most importantly, it's light-filled and envisioned it as a kind of clearing in the woodlands with an architectural lantern and scrim above. And I'm sure some of you saw Air St. Gross's presentation last fall about this. I thought you'd enjoy seeing some of the advancement and refinement of the design. you're looking at the progress of a day. That scrim of the lantern modulates the light through the passage of the day. The lobby looks through, you can just barely see it, to one of the Shaw ginkgos, one of the early ginkgos planted at the origins of the botanical garden. And the pattern on that scrim is created literally from a digitized photograph excuse me, of the branching and leaf pattern of that ginkgo repeated on the scrim as it wraps around the lantern. That ginkgo, in many ways, is the centerpiece of the design, a kind of celebrated punctuation, but also affirmation of this new south axis. It has a complementary north-south axis, the event axis to its east that passes through the events lobby, then through a new door cut in what was the backside of the Linnaean house, opening to the rose garden to its south, and then extending and aligned with the historic Shaw house axes far to the south. Those axes are enriched by a series of east-west axes that knit this kind of golden rectangle together. The Ottoman axis, the first one in the north, connects the theater, introduction film, to the Ottoman garden with a new garden gate through its western wall that draws that real gem that so many people missed into the composition of the garden. The Linnaean axis, just to its south, connects the new conservatory with the existing passage through the Linnaean house, and then to its south, the Swift axis aligns with the trolley waiting area canopy, and it's punctuated where it crosses the south axis with a new aquatic pool that I'll touch on briefly in a second. And then once again, south of that, the rose garden axis is punctuated by a wellhead on the south axis. That south axis is composed of a central planting with flanking walkways and seating. Those pathways then wrap around and celebrate the ginkgo as centerpiece before it goes on to connect to the climatron just beyond. We'll take a walk down that axis in a sense, and it begins with the south terrace, just on the south side of the lobby. You see the lantern and the scrim of the lobby there. That terrace leads to the garden walk, and you see some of the early sketches and explorations of that garden walk in plan, in section, and in sketch perspective. You see it here as you emerge from the lobby looking south with the ginkgo in the distance, centered on a low planted bed flanked by walks and seating and framed by a mixed woodland alley along the left and the right-hand side. This approach, this arrival, is south-facing, so you're looking into the sun, particularly in the cooler parts of the year. That means the plantings are dramatically backlit, and in the fall, when the ginkgo turns its own kind of brilliant, clear yellow, it becomes its own lantern, and in a way, a kind of natural complement to the lobby lantern that we talked about earlier. That experience of moving towards that ginkgo is punctuated with an aquatic pool that extends the axis, and you see it in the lower portion of the film. It extends the Swift axis, which really is an axis of aquatic pools. It adds one more when it crosses this new south axis. And if we go a little bit further south, just before reaching the ginkgo, there's a quiet wellhead, kind of bird bath, that's aligned with the garden, with the rose garden axes to its right, as you see in that little sketch. I'm going to take one look back at the Ottoman axis, and it comes from the theater on the left, where you see the dot, and extends through, creating a new gate on the west wall and hedge definition of that Ottoman garden. That walk along the Ottoman axes is flanked by alternating Persian and Chinese ironwood. It's spectacular in the fall. It also has a distinctive exfoliating bark, which Ayer St. Gross used both in terms of pattern and color for the ceiling treatment in the event center. So it's a kind of beautiful connection between exterior plantings and major interior spaces, both in the lobby of the main entrance as well as the significant and large ceiling or canopy of the event center. That, I think, gives you a sense of the kind of skeletal framework, almost the bones of this new garden. Andrew is going to talk to you about how the global mission of the garden has influenced the strategies of planting design that flesh out that framework, as well as what I find extremely exciting, and that's beginning to look at the implementation of that vision. So I'm going to give the mic back to Andrew.
Thanks, Michael. It's great. For us on the ground, throughout the planning process, we go back to 2018, 2019, and I'm sure you're all wondering what happened to those landscapes that were existing in those spots, right? What happened to the rhododendrons? What happened to the camellias in the Linnaean house? What did we do as a process to save some of those species? Well, in 2018, 2019, we ran a review of our collections using our living collections database, and we track and record all of the information, like we talked about earlier in the presentation, a documented collection to support science, conservation, research, and education. And so that living collection system documents all of our plants under an accession system, so we can track and record and understand the full collections information associated to those plant species. And so we did a review of the landscapes and looked at any species of conservation concern that we needed to save, any species that weren't represented anywhere else in the garden, any wild collected species that we've gone out into the field and collected, because we've done several, as some of you may know, we've done several collecting trips around the world for conservation, horticultural conservation of species, and brought those back to St. Louis here. So we did a review of the landscape and made sure that we saved those species, moved them out of those areas of the landscape. You can see in front of you here in the pictures, some of the rhododendrons from the rhododendron garden being potted up, some of the smaller ones being potted into containers, some of the larger ones being root bored, and those are actually going to be used back in the design. So there are two beds close to the ginkgo that have a richness of the rhododendrons that we already have in the collections, and so you can see those lined out in what we call the Alfred nursery along Alfred, and we moved about 340 of those rhododendrons. We also harvested the species camellias from the Linnaean house, and several other plant species that were important for us. So in total, we moved about 450 species out of that landscape and either put them into other landscapes in the garden, or they will go back into the landscape in 2023 when we put the landscape together. Could you change the slide? Another important aspect in preserving the landscape, making sure that we preserve key specimens, particularly the ginkgo tree that Michael was talking about. It's not only a very historic tree for us, Henry Shaw, that trees from Henry Shaw's time, but it's also a very important tree botanically for us. And of course, the entire design revolves around that tree. So we want to be very careful with trees like that. So you can see here highlighted in red the tree protection zones in the construction area, and those are put in to actually preserve the trees and make sure that those trees survive the construction. So the big platanus, the beautiful platanus there, and the ginkgo tree are the two main areas that have those tree protection zones. And there's the mitigation around those, work around those areas means that we use lighter equipment, we use weight distribution matting for equipment, and we only enter those areas if absolutely necessary, so that we can preserve those trees. So the ginkgo tree will be around in its splendor after the construction process. Could you change the slide, please? As far as collections planning, when we think about a project like this, and when we think about any project that we do with building the collections in the botanical garden, we look at species of conservation concern. One of our key drivers at the garden for the mission is to make sure that we are conserving species, and so that's one of the overriding things that we look at. And we use things like the International Union for the Conservation of Nature database and NatureServe to understand what the conservation value of a species is, and then build that into our collections and target those species, not just to put into the collection, but also to build conservation work around. So that active conservation process. So the plants selected for this project are no different than that. We did look at conservation concern and built that in as a primary selector for a lot of plant species. And one of the other things that we like to do is we really want to show the world's diversity. The Botanic Garden is active in 35 different countries. We're a true global organization, one of very few botanic gardens which has such a significant global reach. And we wanted to be able to show that plant diversity to our visitors, and that's very, very important within the collections. And we do that through adding plant diversity and making sure that we can make people aware of that plant, of the world's plant diversity. So we're always looking for plant diversity that we don't have in the collections. And we also look at the top picture here on the top right-hand side is of those dots represent the world's botanic gardens, and we're looking for gaps in species collections so that we can actually preserve those in ex situ collections. So we take that into consideration, whether a species is or is not present in another botanical garden. And of course, we always want to connect to the visitor through good story plants. And good story plants can mean plants, wild crop species that enable us to generate the crops that we eat today, plants that contain building materials, plants for medicine, for example. And so we like to make sure that we build those into the collections as well. And of course, if we're putting those in the landscape, plants have to have a degree of display value. So it's important that we have these conservation plants. We're adding diversity, but they also have to look good together. So all of those paradigms go into generating a good design. When it comes to designing with plants in botanic gardens, there are some rules. And Michael was talking about the native plants at Wash U and the plantings there. But one of the things that we have to do for documenting plants is each plant gets an accession number, like a museum collection. Every plant is logged in the database and we can track it on the garden's grounds. So we must be able to track those plants in the garden. And so they have to have defined planting spots. So the two pictures on the right-hand side here, you see a herbaceous border. It's actually a picture of Oxford Botanic Garden with the herbaceous border being defined planting spaces. And the picture on the bottom of the slide there is a mingled species mingled together. We can track species in the upper picture, but we cannot in the lower picture. So we have to be able to track those accessions to be able to make sure that the collection is valuable for research and conservation. And so you see a section of the center access beds there that's taken in the center of the slide, and you can see what Matt's put those plantings in very defined groupings for us so that we can enable us to track those plantings. We can't put two related species very close together or two accessions very close together, and we've got to be able to control the interbridization and seeding. And so all of that's very, very important and forms a critical thing in the design process. For us, where we're targeting for our hardy plant collections, we're basically looking at species which occur in the world's hardy regions for us, for the landscape outside. And right now we're looking at areas of the US, including Missouri, of course, and Appalachian ranges, which is very, very high diversity of plant species, Eastern Europe, Caucasus, Central Asia, China, and Japan. You see that represented here with these red dots. And the red dots you see in a lot of cases follow those areas which are biodiversity hotspots. And biodiversity hotspots are important because they contain about 50% of the world's plant species. So, and also in those regions we have high areas of conservation concern. So we're looking at incorporating species from those areas of the world. Can you change the slide now? From a practical standpoint, when we look at how to cultivate plants in any design, so Michael talked about the avenues and the views and the woodland concept. I'm going to bring it down to a biome concept even. So they follow Michael's vision for the overall master plan of the design. But you can see here in green what we're calling woodlands of the world, which is a woodland biome, and the orangey area is what we call grasslands of the world. And these are the plants in these areas are arranged in biomes, and that's important because the biomes have evolved around the world to be similar in nature, and the plants occur in those biomes need similar care requirements. And so we can grow species from all of those regions in the world that we talked about, the Caucasus, Eastern Europe, China, Japan, and collate them together because they're from similar biomes that we're selecting from. And even in the design, the soil is different in each of these biome areas as well. And so that's really, really important for us to be able to even show and interpret. For instance, in the grasslands of the world, that center access area, we can show the similarities between an American prairie and a European meadow, and a Russian Caucasus grassland, or a Central Asian steppe environment. So we can bring all of those wonderful plant diversity from those biomes together in those design concepts. Next slide. So you see here woodlands of the world from those regions of the world which I talked about. So you can see in the upper left-hand corner the Appalachians. Down in the left here, you see Kyrgyzstan and the Tian Shan Mountains, the fruit and nut areas of the world. And then you see with the bridge here, the beautiful area, Japanese woodlands, the fantastic ghost tree, Davidia involucrata in the center of the picture with the large white bracts, which represents the Chinese woodlands. And then, of course, an open, much more open European woodland here. So we've been able to take species from all of these areas of the world and incorporate those into the design. So you can see see that in the species represented. And the same for grasslands of the world. In that center access area, you've got this wonderful plant diversity from all of these fantastic grasslands of the world. You see peony tenuifolia in the top here, the beautiful the corncockle from the European meadows, and the North American prairies as well. So you see that wonderful plant diversity that we can bring together in those biomes. Next slide, please. Stories are very, very important to us in the garden's collections and representing the garden's mission, and using the collection as a window. It's much more than a window, of course, because it is actively performing the garden's mission. But as we use it as a window, we can interpret the work that the garden's done around the world as well. And so so by selecting species from the Caucasus, we can talk about the red list that the garden produced in the Caucasus region for the Caucasus region of the world, which enabled that region to implement conservation of its plant species. We can talk about the years of work the garden did on the flora of China in collaboration with Chinese researchers. We can talk about the restoration work and the conservation work in Missouri and the US, and the conservation work that we've been recently active in Central Asia for conserving wild crop species, for example. And then we can also look at habitat and landscape stories, talking about comparative biomes, where species occur together, ecological niches. We can talk about evolution of species using those biome concepts, and we can bring that story down to the individual species, conservation stories, stories about taxonomy, how we name plants, how plants are adapted to their environment, and ethnobotanical uses of plants. So all of those wonderful things can be talked about with the landscape. Here are some of the plant species. I'm not going to go through every species on this slide, but here's some of the plant species that represent the species of conservation concern in the collections. You see Magnolia dawsonii, for example. You see Trillium tennesseeensis in the center of the slide there. That beautiful yellow tree is Betula uber, which is one of the rarest trees in North America. Above that is Ruus mathuxii, which is a federally endangered species. Castanea dentata, of course, was once very prevalent in the United States. About 4 billion trees disappeared in the early part of the 20th century through the Appalachian region. So all of these species are of conservation concern, active part of the garden's conservation efforts, and we can tell the story of them in the landscape. A large part of the garden's work, of course, is naming plant species, and it's a good thing to be able to do to invite people to look at that plant diversity and understand that plant diversity in the landscapes. On the left-hand side of the slide here, you see 2 species of Amsonia. We've replicated and purposefully put a lot of species in the collections to be able to show the diversity of a given genera. So Amsonia is one of those species where we picked a lot of Amsonias for that purpose. The center of the slide here, Michael mentioned that access down to the Ottoman garden. This is Parodia persica on the top, and the bottom is Parodia subaquilis. Parodia persica from the Hyrcanian woodlands in Azerbaijan and Iran, and Parodia subsequilis from central China in the Nanjing region. So they evolved several thousand miles apart, but yet they're a very related species, and so we can use the landscape to show that. Same for the Liriodendron here on the right-hand side of the slide. Liriodendron tulipifloria and Liriodendron chinensis. Liriodendron tulipifloria is a Midwestern native species, and Liriodendron chinensis is from China. So you can use those to explain those things. I put one slide in here to talk a little bit about the Linnaean House and the conservatory. So the Linnaean House, we're very, very excited to be able to bring it back in time a little bit. Oranges were very popular when gardens and individuals went out to cultivate plants from around the world. They were used to extend the season. So in between the 17th and 19th century, it became very popular structures to grow that wonderful diversity from around the world. So things like pineapple, or the oranges, giving them the name, the orangery. And you can see an early picture down here, the black and white image of an orangery in the 17th century, lined out containerized plant species. And in 1907, you can see 1907, you can see a picture of the Linnaean House here with containerized plant material. So we've removed the beds in the Linnaean House purposefully because it brings it back to that original purpose. And what's going back in there is about 350 containerized plant species, bringing that diversity from behind the scenes we have in the garden and showing it off in containers. So we're bringing in pottery from Italy to be able to plant that space up. So we're excited about that space, being able to do that. The conservatory, this is not the actual final design drawing. It's a phased drawing, so you're going to see a surprise when you see the conservatory go in, which is good. But it allows me to talk about the concept of the conservatory here from a planting perspective. So the conservatory, we're very, very excited about the climate control in. We're able to control the climate in there to be able to grow leucospermums, banksias, and isoplexis here that you can see on the right-hand side of the slide. We can control the heat of the summer in there. So for those permanent beds, those raised beds that you can see, those upper areas of the beds will have permanent Mediterranean plantings from Mediterranean biomes of the world, South Africa, Australia, Chile, Mediterranean, and California. And then those lower areas, those display areas will be used for the floral displays that you're familiar with, the orchid show, the holiday show, and we'll also increase the number of shows between, probably focused on the Mediterranean flora in between us. We're very excited by that space, mixing a small event space with the beauty of the flora of the Mediterranean and the flexible floral shows as well. You can see here our efforts, I think, have paid off pretty well to be able to balance the mission of the garden with what you're seeing in the landscape. So new to the collection, we have 153 species. That's 47% of the landscape is brand new species. So you get to see some things that you haven't seen at the garden. 42% of the species, 138 of the species are native to the US. 25%, 80 species are native to Missouri, and about 58% of the landscape is non-native to the US. But really exciting as well for us is that we have 34% of the landscape, plants in the landscape, which are of conservation concern. And if you looked at the previous numbers for the previous landscape, that number associated to conservation concern and new to the collection was almost zero. So we're very excited to have a significant increase in supporting the garden's mission from the landscape as well. So how did we go about procuring those species for landscape? So once the design was finished, and we went about and we collaboratively developed the planting plan, which Matt's going to talk about. We then went into a process by where we field collected some of the specimens. So we collected some in the field in Missouri, brought those back, cleaned the seed, and sowed them. We have exchanged a system called Index Seminum with about 350 botanic gardens globally. So we sent that list out, and we asked botanic gardens to send us seed from species around the world that was on the list, and we got species sent to us from those botanic gardens. We looked for our own seed bank and drawed upon the resources that we already had, and also propagated from our existing species in the living collection. And then which we couldn't find and we couldn't get in from Index Seminum or field collecting, we actually purchased some in commercially, but we always did so from the smallest amount of material possible. And so that was important for us to be able to grow those species. We're into knowledge building at the garden, not just being able to add those species as finished plants. We want to grow them to be able to learn how to grow those species. So this is a drone image of some of those species coming along at the new hardy plant nursery, the Orley Hardy Plant Nursery. And you can see this particular bench is one of 10 benches which are devoted to plants for the project. And that's we're growing on average of about to accommodate the 30,500 plants needed for the project, representing about 350 species. We're growing about 45,000 individual plants at the nursery to satisfy that. One of the benefits may not be really obvious to people because it's underground, but it is really exciting for us. These two 25,000-gallon rainwater collection tanks, which are part of the project. So this has a very tangential benefit to the collections, tangible benefit to the collections behind the scenes of the garden here. So you see in the left-hand side on the bottom of the slide is the tropical nursery. And we grow some of the world's largest collections of orchids and aroids in there, which are very finicky on the water requirements. And right now we're using city water, which has high chlorine content, very high pH. And lots of lime in it. And we also grow very, very finicky rare species. And the picture in the center of the slide here is Coronia gigas, which has recently been in the news as being newly flowered at the garden here. But it too is also very finicky on the water as well. So the ability to be able to use rainwater and filtered reverse osmosis water is very, very important. All that's a component of the project. So that's going to improve our nursery functions. I'm going to pass it over to Matt.
Thanks, Andrew. My name is Matt Sickle, and I'm a landscape architect at MVLA and the lead planting designer for the project's exterior gardens. This was a really special project for MVLA, and that we were able to collaborate so intensively with our client on this planting design. That doesn't happen for every project for us. On this one, we brought a lot of ideas, but we were also just kind of racing to keep up with the horticultural staff the whole time and learning a lot from them. As Andrew mentioned earlier, we've included over 330 different plant species on this project. But in order to settle on that final list, we gave serious consideration to about 990 different species throughout our design. We debated the merits of each one with the garden staff, and we thought about how well they would perform in St. Louis and discussed ideas like design and conservation with them. And so the story of the planting design process, as Michael and Andrew have both mentioned, for us was all about collaboration. It was the only way to design planting that satisfies all of the garden's distinct missions, both to conserve plants and to educate people about them, and create a great experience of visitors, or experience for visitors. Excuse me. So this image reminds me of how the collaboration with the architects and the garden staff informed the final design. Early renderings of the garden, like this one, captured MVLA's vision for a garden with lots of different species living in dynamic and interesting relationships. From our early perspective, what a great landscape idea. But the more we dove in with the garden staff, we began to understand their perspective that a mixed matrix of species would actually be unhelpful for telling the individual story of plants that they could track and catalog and research. And so we shifted the way we designed the plants into these cohesive groupings. It was my idea to bring all these ideas about the importance of individual rare species, conservation, and plants that created a great experience together into one organized garden and planting design. Beginning on the north slope, the first garden that visitors will experience when they come to the new visitor center and landscape that's under construction. The planting design strategy was to create a multi-layered world woodland that used complementary groupings of canopy trees, understory trees, shrubs, and then a ground layer of herbaceous planting. We used all of these plants to shape the views of the new entrance, to guide guests toward the building entrances, and to screen some of the less desirable shoulder views of the peripheral uses. In the center, we organized long, attenuated masses of species that stretch from east to west, following the guests as they explore on their way to the door. And then to maximize planting diversity, as Andrew mentioned, instead of repeating dozens of instances of a single species, many members of one genus tend to hopscotch around the space, offering a sense of unity with a lot of variety if you look more closely. So for instance, if there are two species of geranium on the east, there's two different species of geranium on the west, and so on like that. The same is true for anemone, columbine, baptisia, and then mingled throughout all of those are a lot of new additions to the garden's collection. So on the southern side of the new visitor center, we used a lot of similar strategies, but in some different ways. Plantings south of the visitor center will tend to orient guests toward the climatron and send them out in the direction of the garden beyond, while trying not to reveal too much of the adjacent gardens too soon. On the south side, particularly the tallest shrubs that frame the southern access are going to be oriented in a loose diagonal pattern. They're going to shield views to the east and west as guests enter the garden, but will allow filtered views of the nearby gardens as guests are walking to the north if they're heading toward the exit or the events spaces. And we used the same kind of thinking that we just showed you in plan to organize the vertical arrangement of the plants as well, to shape the way that visitors view and experience the south axis. Generally, as a rule, the shortest species will grow along the center line, giving the clearest views down the center of the world woodland alley. And then along the perimeters, taller species create enclosure, grasses, and shade-loving ground covers slip and sneak in between those shrubs. And speaking of trees, as Andrew mentioned earlier, the collection of plants and seeds for the visitor center was truly global, with meticulous record keeping sought for the origins of each specimen. But the project's 4-year time frame meant that at best, the tree that was collected from seed would be a little seedling when it was planted, which is not ideal if you're working to create a garden with a sense of form and enclosure that looks great on opening day. And so what we did to compromise with the garden's competing missions was a nationwide search for tree species at commercial nurseries that could be both useful to the garden, but that would also provide the right sorts of shade and form and color right at the very beginning on opening day. And then we made a plan to distribute those carefully. We balanced the locations of the more mature trees that were commercially grown with the specimen seedlings that support the garden's mission. Even after the trees were selected, designing a garden with 332 species in it is a really complex exercise in imagining the relationship of those plants across time. It was a really big puzzle for us, and so we decided that we couldn't imagine it all at once. We needed to draw diagrams to help us think through how that would happen. And so the seasonal changes in each plant's appearance are important to the design success because it does not include any annual flowers. The plants are not designed to be swapped in and out of this space in the garden. We needed to select perennial species that would complement their neighbors year round. And so this plan and the plans that follow show each plant's bloom or dominant foliage color at 4 times of year. When you visit beginning in early spring, expect to see a flurry of ephemeral flowers like anemones and trillium and a lot of bulb species that are woven under the grasses and forbs that are going to spring up in the same spot later in the year. In the summer, watch out for the flowering perennial grasses and ferns to take over on the ground layer. Expect lots of whites and pinks and blues. And then later in the year, the color palette will shift a little bit warmer with the late summer perennials. Grass species will be showy and the canopy trees will provide shade for visitors that are brave enough to come to the garden in St. Louis in August. And then finally, the canopy trees planned for the project include some with awesome color. Maples, poplars, and birch are going to light up the north garden, with the ironwood along the Ottoman axis going to be a blend of deep red and bright orange in the fall. And of course, the bright yellow ginkgo is going to invite guests along the south axis deeper into the garden. Grasses, evergreen perennials, and the textures of dormant stems, bark, and branches are what's going to carry the space through the fall and beyond. And so we just had a lot of fun designing these gardens for the Missouri Botanical Garden. We're excited to see them built, and we can't wait to visit them with you someday.